I want to take you through my ideas, my thinking around the task that I set in Unit 3.3 to give you some idea of what I eventually did with that and why. Um, so what I'm trying to achieve here is I'm trying to get you to see the relationship between pedagogy, I guess the issues that we've talked about in terms of reading, the kind of new notion of reading, the fact that reading occurs online as well as in more traditional formats. And so I picked a text that is a reading text, and here it's here online, although for the purposes of this I've taken it offline, and I can put it into a Google Doc as well, so you can copy and paste it. Now of course, in the modern world, a lot of text is accompanied by video material, and this is also the case here. So we could think about how we make the relationship between the video and the written text, and see which way we might utilize it. With learners now, they might find accessing text through video an easy way of doing things, or perhaps the video illustrates some of the language in an appropriate way. But I want to start with the text because this is what we've been focusing on. Now this is quite a clean text. It doesn't have many links in it. They've got a few, but not many, and you can change that. As I say, you could take this text and you could put it into Google Doc, and you could put a number of links in to support that text. If you wanted, you could put in some pictures, link pictures, you could put in some definitions, and so on and so forth. So that will be one way of dealing with it, making it into an electronic worksheet, another idea I've talked about. But even though I talked about the idea of using Kahoot, I wanted to explore I decided, having looked at Kahoot initially, that it wasn't going to serve my purposes as a technology, and I wanted to try a different way of doing things. So I selected to use a Google form. As I'm sure you've cottoned on, I'm pretty interested in Google as a tool, and I think it's got lots of potential in all sorts of ways in different contexts, both in teacher development, in the way that I use it, but also in language teaching as well. So I set up this form, and initially when I set it up and I tried it out in the class, I put in restrictions after each question, so to try and force people to answer the questions. But I realized quite quickly in the classroom that wasn't going to work, because I needed to get them to submit answers so that I could actually see what their answers were. So my idea is, we have a big class, and I want to get people to engage and use language. And if I just ask for answers around the class, get typical people answering as normal, and it limits the amount of language that people can use. So if I use it in this kind of way, everybody is encouraged to give an answer. So what happens is you can send people the URL. So if you click on the send, you've got various options here. You can get a linked URL, and you can shorten that URL to make it more usable in class. In fact, you can make it even shorter by using tinyURL or the Google shortener system. So that's possible, and you get set it up so that people can use that, and that's one way of dealing with things. So here we have the actual form as it's sent out to people. So at the bottom you'll see the submit button now, and I say to people in the class, okay, this is the first task, what's the difference between a canoe and a kayak? So I want them to think about the title. So if you've looked at the pre-reading task, the strategies around reading, you'll see the notion of having a pre-reading task. So I want people to kind of look at that information and see what they can find out about it. So they look on the internet, they might already know the difference. I don't know. Anyway, people give different answers. So if I put an answer in, a kayak is usually a closed boat that you sit in, and a canoe is an open boat that you kneel in. Okay, let's assume that that's what we're going to put in as an answer. So there's a little instruction there. After working to answer each question, you need to go to the bottom and press submit. So don't forget, this is a face-to-face class that I'm working in, so it goes back, and you're going to have to show them how this works initially. They'll get used to the idea as you go through, so you can keep going back to the form and putting in different answers. So what words would you expect to find in the text? Maybe find shoe, maybe find helmet, maybe find canoe. All right, so again, we submit that, and each time they need to submit another response. So I'm going to click a couple of these just to show you, how it works. All right. So when I go back now to my own version of the document, the teacher's version of the document, you see here that there's the questions. I can see the responses immediately. So I can see the responses that people have given. So we can talk about that. We can immediately discuss it. We can look at why things are right or wrong and get people to talk about it. So you're kind of increasingly engaging with the language and doing things that might be, encourage them to actually think about the language, and you ask them how to do this. Now, one of the issues here is actually making people realize how as teachers, how difficult it is to actually produce useful questions. I mean, when you're doing something like, for example, this, it's quite difficult to create good multiple choice questions. I mean, one of the things I sort of said to many people over the years, I used to be an item writer for Cambridge. I did a lot of materials writing for tests in the early stages of my career, and actually producing items is very difficult. I mean, the classic mistake that people make is that the longest answer tends to be the right one. So if you look at a lot of multiple choice questions and you work on them in a different language, it's surprisingly how close you can get to 50% just by clicking all of the long answers. So I know that, so I actually play with that idea when I create items. So here I've transferred some of the information. I've taken words that are similar in meaning to some in the text. I've expanded wellies to Wellington boots. I put in some obvious, wrong answers, tap shoes, although they might not know what tap shoes are, and so on. So, I've tried to be quite clever in getting them to engage with and translate the what's in the text into their own language. So that's something to think about as you do things. And I picked up a particular cultural issue there that in the US they tend to express temperature in Fahrenheit, and actually that's something that just as a little kind of game-like bit at the end. So that's my way of managing the learners through the task. So I do a number of activities that relate to strategies. So getting people to skim the text, to look for items, to get a general sense of the meaning of the text, and to scan for particular items to actually find ideas. And working with definitions, trying to get them to understand what layering means and why we call it that, and wicking, and there's some quite technical vocabulary, admittedly, but it's not about that. It's about trying to get people to learn how to get meaning from text, how to understand text, and using tools like the internet to support that. So that's partly what I'm trying to do there. So it can take quite a long time to work through that, but then at the end what I thought I might do, and this is again, I tried this out with the group. I created a comprehension test at the end, and this was played in the typical Kahoot way. If you don't know Kahoot, it's kind of designed as a classroom tool to try and get people engaged. It has gamification built into it. In the sense that it tries to get people to play against each other. So there's an element, after each question, it shows you how many people got it right and got it wrong. So you can talk about that. I mean, you can actually get people to engage with the questions, think about why it might be wrong and why it might be right. And again, I've played with some of the wording of these items to make it actually look quite difficult. So not look difficult, sorry, that's not what I meant. I've done it so that people have to sort of think through, why have you chosen a particular answer. It's not just a matter of a right or wrong answer. There are different options. So for example, if we look at which gloves would be best worn in warm weather, the answer that the text implies are lightweight gloves, but actually, some of these other gloves might also be appropriate. So something like neoprene, for example, because it's a synthetic material, and it gets wet, it actually might keep you quite dry, and then as a result, you're not sweating. So there are different reasons for thinking about that, and maybe neoprene is also quite lightweight as well. So there is some interesting debate there that we can have about that. Now, what I did at the end is I wanted to go back to the idea of text reconstruction. Text reconstruction is perhaps something that's dropped off people's radar more recently, but was historically was an important part of the way that we use technology in the early stages. Lots of research articles were dedicated to this particular tool, and it had a good reason. And the idea of getting people to engage with text, particularly in small groups, to talk about the language, to interact with it. So this text reconstruction, this is one of the tools that I have a link to on the wiki, and can be, you can just grab a piece of text and put it in, and the students can work on this, or they can take their own text and work on it. So working in small groups, they put in words, and you can see here that I've already started putting in a few words, and I'm slowly kind of reconstructing the text. You can actually see the text here, so that they can look back at it. So it partly encourages, maybe you could argue, it encourages a sort of memorization, but you can also do other things as well around it, so that people get a sense of how a text is constructed, what it should be look like, what's difficult about working with a text, and so on. So that's basically how I finished it off. So people have worked through, they've engaged with the text, they've had they've thought about it in advance, they get their schema activated at the beginning by talking about the general issues around a text, differences between canoeing and kayaking. They then try and encourage to get a general sense of what the text is about. They're encouraged to engage with different parts of the text, with different bits of the language. They're encouraged to think about how you might use the context to understand language, and they get a comprehension test at the end, which probably relates to the kind of activity that they would have to do in the exam. And then finally, you engage with the kind of cognitive guessing game of text reconstruction, to get them really to focus on the nature of language. And you can do this as a class. You don't have to do it, you don't have to do this individually or in small groups. This can be done as a class, as a reminder to the students of what a text like this looks like, and why does it look like this, and why does it contain words like this, because it's got a particular particular structure, it's a descriptive text, and so on. Okay, so those are some of the ideas I came up with, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say about that.